The title is Collaborating to Reach More People with Nutritious Foods. The chair for this panel and the moderator is Rachel Kite. She's the chair of the CGIAR Fund Council. She's also vice president, World Bank, and a member of the Global Panel on Agriculture and Food Systems for Nutrition.
We've tried to bring you the best and maybe the brightest, I don't know, let's put some pressure on them. So it's an illustrious panel coming from very many different sectors. Dr. Akin Adesina, the Honourable Minister of Agriculture from Nigeria, who's also a fellow panellist of mine in the Global Panel for Agriculture, Food Systems and Nutrition. He has had a long career. You name it, he's done it. And he's been a leading activist, I think was the right phrase, within the CGIAR. He has a PhD from Purdue. He was the vice president of AGRA, as many of you know. He had a senior role in the Rockefeller Foundation, and of course the UN Secretary General tapped him to help with the visioning exercise behind the future of the MDGs. So I think what we heard from him last night was this passion that drives him to find a way for agriculture not to just manage hunger but to end it. And it'll be very interesting to hear from him. We're going to be joined a little bit later by Dr. Agnes Benagwa, who is, of course, the Minister of Health here in Rwanda. She has a medical degree, she has a master's in pediatrics, specializes in emergency pediatrics, neonatology, and the treatment of HIV/AIDS. She's practiced medicine both here and in other countries. And she's a member of the editorial boards of 2 respected journals, chairs the Rwanda Country Coordinating Mechanism for the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. And she's part of the Global Task Force on Expanded Access to Cancer Care and Control in Developing Countries. So she will bring the health public sector experience to the table. Which brings me to Dr. Ruben Echevarria, who also needs very little introduction for this audience, a career that goes for more than 30 years in agriculture and rural development. He has a PhD from the University of Minnesota. He formerly worked in several leadership positions in the Inter-American Development Bank, and during his time there created the Regional Fund for Agricultural Technology, an endowment that funds competitive regional agricultural research. His extensive experience in the CGIAR as well, and is currently the Director General of CIAT, based in Colombia, and a past Executive Director of the Science Council of the CGIAR. And CIAT's really coming forward with some really path-breaking research at the moment. So, agricultural research. Fourth, I come to Jonathan Schreier, who is the Acting Special Representative of the Office of Global Food Security in the United States at USAID. He is part of the interagency leadership within the USA of the presidential initiative to address global hunger. He leads all diplomatic efforts on global hunger and food security, including those related to the G7, the G20, and other multilateral institutions. This includes serving with Feed the Future, the global hunger and food security initiative launched by the USA. He's had a long diplomatic career and has worked in the US Department of Energy and has helped design and establish the Energy and Climate Change Partnership of the Americas, launched by President Obama as well. So welcome, Jonathan. Now we're going to go to the other side of the pond, to the UK. And last but by no means least, I want to introduce you, many of you already know him, is Dr. Tim Wheeler, who is the Deputy Chief Scientific Advisor for the UK Department of International Development. There, I think his 2 most important roles, he plays many roles, are really to supervise and provide science advice to the leadership of DFID and to ministers, but also to oversee the research portfolio of what is one of the largest development aid participants in the world. He is also a professor of crop science at the University of Reading, and for more than 20 years he's been publishing on how climate change will potentially impact on the sustainability of agriculture and food, very close to my heart with my new mandate at the World Bank. Dr. Wheeler has provided advice up to the board level to food multinationals and agribusiness companies, and it has extensive work experience with policymakers in the UK and internationally, including providing special advice to the House of Lords in the UK, the upper house of Parliament. So, Dr. Wheeler, thank you for joining us. So, as you can see, we have an extremely experienced panel across a range of sectors to start our discussions. And I'm going to go and sit in the middle of them. But I'm going to ask a first round of questions. Some will use the podium to respond, some will do so from their chairs. It's whatever is the most comfortable for them. But we talked about accountability last night at dinner. So the accountability index for you guys and for you, Madam Minister, for this session is to not only survey the arena about which we're talking, which is that of collaboration, but I also want you, where you can, to sort of show where the personal leadership that you bring to the issue can make the most effect. So what are you prepared to sort of go home from here having committed to do? And then we're going to open it up to all of you, which is where your accountability comes in as well, because every single one of you, if you're in this room, is a leader. And so what we're really looking for in the Q&A is you can ask a question, but it would be really great if when you ask a question, you stand up and say, and you know, when I leave this room today, this is what I am going to do. This is what I will commit to doing. So the first question goes to you, Minister Adesina. So when it comes to scaling up effective interventions, and I think as a result of the last couple of days, it seems to be conclusive that we would consider biofortification to be one of those effective interventions. It seems that we need enabling policy environments in order to support scale up, scale out. It'd be interesting to hear from you as a minister, but also having played so many other roles. What do you think is critical from a policy environment perspective, and who else do you need at the table as a policy maker to expand access to nutrient-enhanced crops? And how, as a minister, do you need assurance that people are going to work together? I mean, you can't police everybody to make sure that they're playing well with others, right? You're not running a kindergarten. What do you need as a minister, and what kind of policy signals can you send to others that will support collaboration?
Thanks very much, Rachel. I think first and foremost is I come with a perspective that unless you are really ashamed about something, you have no incentive to change it. The situation that I see with regard to malnutrition in Africa today as a policymaker is something that I find enormously shameful, because it doesn't make any sense at all that 12 children will be dying every minute from malnutrition that can be avoided and should be avoided. It doesn't make any sense that we have 240 million people that can't feed themselves well and therefore suffer from all kinds of problems. And as you know that we have the situation where 80% of those that are malnourished today in the world are found in 14 countries. And 8 of those are found in Africa. So these are not statistics that we should be proud of at all. So the first point I want to make is that we must have and muscle up the political will to change that particular situation. I don't believe Africa should be known for this. I think we must solve this problem, and we have what it takes to do it. Secondly is, I think we need to begin to look at the issue of malnutrition from a very different, with different perspective. The evidence is clear that if you're malnourished or you're stunted, it has significant impact on the ability of your population to earn incomes in the future. It has impact on the GDP of the countries in the future. So for me, what we've got to be looking at is how do you build people's gray matter infrastructure? Because the ministers of finance, obviously, that I need to get financing behind this, need to understand that it's not a social service. It's not a grant. You're not helping people with handouts. But in fact, you are investing in the core of the economy. People have good food to eat. The kids go to school well. they stay in school, they have nutritious food, their mental capacity, cognitive power is developed, the economic benefits way into the future. So it's all about investment. And I think changing that perspective in the relationship with the Ministry of Finance is very, very important. Now, it's also more than just government. Government can only play a role. The private sector has to play a role. So we've got to make sure that we position this in terms of what are those businesses that can produce the biofortified crops, that can process things, that can have fortified foods, and get it into the supply chain. And so we do need to have the private sector there. But finally, let me just say that it takes more than just agriculture. I'm delighted that my colleague is here from the Minister of Health from Rwanda, and her colleague is here. You know, we've got to work across sectors. It's got to take agriculture, because we have to raise productivity of agriculture, without which you make no progress on tackling the problem. You've got to make sure there's water and sanitation. We've got to make sure that school feeding programs work, for which we need the ministries of education. And we also need to have the health ministries involved. So these are all the critical players that I think are needed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, that's a great segue into my question for Minister Binagwaku. So I think we've all had an experience, we've all had the opportunity in the last couple of days to listen to both yourself and your fellow ministers in the Rwandan cabinet, obviously led by the President, in terms of this multi-sectoral approach with Ministry of Agriculture and Ministry of Health, you know, down to the community health worker, agricultural worker, closely collaborating at the village level. So, and I think many of us have been very inspired by how this is working at the sort of client relationship level, right, where the rubber hits the road. But I think it would be really interesting to hear from you in, you know, what have been the principal lessons that you've learned in building this multi-sectoral approach that now we use Rwanda as such an example of. You know, what's been easy about it, what's been difficult about it, and as other countries look to copy, to replicate, to be inspired by what you've done, what should they watch out for? Minister.
First of all, I will say never copy, imagine yourself. Because we create what suits Rwanda. And we discovered it while we were working. Because malnutrition is, personally, I take it as a pediatrician, as a Minister of Health, of one of my failures. Because there are so many things I have learned too late that we have implemented too late. And also malnutrition, the fight against malnutrition is the most multi-sectorial fight ever in all my career. Not only as minister, as PS, as anything, even as a doctor. The most because it includes the private sector, the agricultural sector, the education sector, because food at school is one of the biggest areas where we can act also, and educating the children for educating the parents. It implicates Minister of Gender, because in this country, Minister of Gender and Family Promotion is in charge to change the mindset at family level. It involves Minister of Youth, because we have so many constituencies among youth, the guide, the Catholic one, the non-Catholic, etc., where we can give messages and also another way to see what nutrition is. It teaches also that it's not the most poor part of Rwanda where we find the most malnourished children. Wealthy families feed badly their children because they didn't know. So it involves also the parliament. Your previous question was about legal framework. We need to protect the people who are growing crops as a small group, but also the agribusiness. We need to see what is food fortification. So it's everything. So we have learned that, and I think now we are on good track the last 2 years through another system called the social cluster. The social cluster is chaired by the Minister of Health, co-chaired by the Minister of Education, are in Minister of Agriculture, local government, gender, youth, etc. And when we have a budget problem, we can call the Minister of Finance. When we have a problem of food supplement for fighting malnutrition, we can call the Minister of Commerce, because I cannot issue an instruction that will put the private sector in incapacity to fulfill it or not to compete with the region. So there is so many things that we have learned, but doing differently, we will fail. That's what we learn, and it's working well. That's how now we have an instruction for food supplement. We have a partnership with Minister of Education, what is going to use at school for feed the children, using those principles. We are supported, and we support the Minister of Gender with messages how to change the way families are preparing food, what they prepare by age, how they do at different periods of the life of a Rwandan. And we also is involved the minister in charge of East African community, because we need to see that our legal framework fit in the region. If not, we are stopped by the supra-parliament of East Africa. And taxes, because there are some facility we want to give to promote some good food. And so Minister of Finance, the Rwanda Revenue Authority, everybody is around this fight. So that's what we have learned. And as other countries have other way to govern, the outcome should be the same, but the way to do it is always country by country customized. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's really interesting. I mean, first of all, implicit through everything you said was leadership, right? So this isn't going to happen without leaders with vision, and obviously when it becomes a comprehensive effort of government, you need the kind of support that you've got from your head of state, and that Minister Adesina's got from his head of state. So I think that's very important for all the people who feel like they've been working, out in the boonies on nutrition for years and years. To have this come to the top of the agenda, I think is really quite amazing. The other thing that I think was interesting is the policy environment. Some of the policy environment that you both talked about is specific to biofortification or to nutrition enhancement, but some of it's actually generic regulation for trading and opening up markets in a responsible way. So now I'm going to move continents a little bit and move to ag research to Ruben. So how does CIAT see this? I mean, we heard the announcement, I think, at the beginning of this conference from Frank Riesman, CEO of the CGIAR Consortium, that CGIAR is going to, and some would say finally, but mainstream nutrition into its ag research. How do you as a CGIAR centre think about this? What can you do? What do you think have been the big successes? But also, what are the opportunities which are still out there to be capitalised upon?
Sure, thank you, Rachel. Very, very, very challenging question. For us in the global community, we cannot call the Minister of Finance. So we cannot, like my two colleagues in the panel. So our challenge is how to really assemble the best research team. You need researchers to do research. And for that, you need to really retain these scientific capacities over time, focusing on the right priority. So we believe that research takes time. And before I try to answer your question, let me say that 10 years ago, when we had a research question, I'm looking at Howdy, when we had a research question, when we start with a research question, we usually don't know the answer. That's why we're doing the research. We didn't know that this was going to happen in 10 years. 10 years may seem like a long time for many of you, but it's a very short time in research is really short. And if you look around, you will see it's only 10 years. So from our perspective, we linked it first to our base, which is the plant genetic resources. That all of this cannot happen if you don't have this biodiversity well conserved and well managed in gene banks. So that's kind of one of the key pillars of our work. And now these resources have proved, as many of you scientists here know, extremely valuable for the traits that we've been using to biofortify these crops. And for example, 4 crops that Harvest Plus has improved for Africa, the beans and the maize and the cassava and the sweet potato, all originated in Latin America. So my point here, and they are not for Latin Americans, they are for humankind. So, but my point here is this is a global effort, Rachel, and we love funding which is targeted. You say, we are going to have outcomes in these 9 countries and these 15 countries. That's great to do, but also we have to think very global, because without our South-South biodiversity collaboration, this success that we are all happy here couldn't have happened. The sources of high iron beans, I am in iron bean country here, so and working for SIA, I need to mention the iron beans, were land races from North and South America. Those are the traits, and they're only there. So that has helped a lot. The other one that, from a research perspective and from a South American perspective, perhaps I will stress, is the value of the South-South collaboration with our partners. As you know, for very good reasons, donors have been focusing in other regions lately, not too much in Latin America. So what we are trying to do is take advantage of that growth in emerging economies like Brazil or Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and many others, and stress this value South-South. So one example that we are working on, and we have done with Embrapa, is transferring this cassava germplasm with high beta-carotene content from Brazil to IITA, our sister center, to work in national programs in Africa. So that's another role of bridging this science capacity that is not only doing science for development in the country where we are based, but is linking much globally. There is much more to do, and as we broaden the scope of biodiversity and biofortification research, there may be many other land races sitting around in those regions that we haven't collected yet. So our plea from the research community here is that, yes, it seems to many of you that we are done and now we need to scale up, but believe me, there is a lot of research. 80% of our research is called maintenance research. It's just to keep the yields as you know them. So research needs to continue. Gene banks have to be strengthened, and the partnerships are very important for doing that. Thanks.
I was talking earlier to Ian Barker from Syngenta Foundation, and we were talking about perverse effects. I mean, this point that it takes so many people and so many different walks of life to come together to make this really take off. And we were talking about the potential perversity of things that are being negotiated under the Biodiversity Convention that may impact on the collaboration that we need around plant genetic resources in order to keep on meeting the world's needs for nutrition. So if there's any Ministry of Environment officials in the room, be aware. I'm going to go flip now back to the US, to Jonathan. In the many roles that you've played a very important role in Feed the Future, which has made a concerted effort to build a multi-sectoral collaboration around these issues. And you heard about the collaboration at a sort of country-owned perspective from the ministers, but from an international perspective, what have been the challenges, but also the opportunities from multi-sectoral, multi-partner nutrition collaboration? What have you learned?
Sure. Thanks, Rachel, and thanks also to the government of Rwanda for hosting this important conference, and to Harvest Plus for the extraordinary leadership in this field of biofortification. The U.S. is honored to be one of your partners and supporters in this effort. Rachel, on your question, let me talk about some of the things that we've learned. One is to get things going, it's just as we heard from a couple of the ministers, you do need leadership, clear leadership at the national level to have an effective multi-agency effort like Feed the Future. And so President Obama provided that leadership for the U.S. by addressing the challenge of global hunger in his first hour in office. In his first inaugural address, he said that we would be there to help the world's hungry. And soon thereafter, he called for the establishment of a new U.S. food security initiative, which became Feed the Future. And it's that clarity from the top that's just so important when you're trying to have a whole of government effort. Now, our effort focuses on tackling the root causes of undernutrition based on evidence-based interventions. We do the work through Feed the Future and also work through Food for Peace, our food aid program, and our Global Health Initiative. Within Feed the Future, we further refined that clarity of purpose around the idea that we are focused on smallholder farmers, particularly women, and that we're intent on supporting our partner countries in achieving their own priorities. Their priorities to reduce hunger and undernutrition, and so we've set top-line targets for the initiative of reducing poverty, the prevalence of poverty in the areas in which we work, by 20% over 5 years, and to reduce the prevalence of child stunting by 20% in the areas in which we work over 5 years. And we knew we had to put nutrition up there at the top with its own target, because we've heard from others today, including on this panel, that if you simply look to grow more food, if you simply look to fill bellies, you can solve the hunger problem. And poverty alleviation tends to to reduce hunger as measured by caloric intake. But to solve nutrition, you need targeted interventions. You need a sense of the nutrition problem and the many dimensions of it and the many things that contribute to success. And so you do need these kinds of multi-sectoral approaches. And that's why we work in partnership with governments in the countries in which we work, with other donor organizations. So a nod to my colleague from DFID, but many others, and the international organizations and multilateral development banks. Rachel, thank you. And the private sector, because again, if we can't make this work in a commercially sustainable fashion over time, we condemn ourselves to perpetual donor assistance and perpetual public support in countries, in our partner countries. And we also need civil society as part of the team. Because they can play many important roles in getting information out, in executing programs, and bringing resources to the table, and to helping organize and provide a voice for the communities that we're trying to reach. And we also take, as I said, complex approaches to solving the problem. So we don't just work on, we do work on biofortified crops, and that's important. But we know, and we do work here in Rwanda with the high iron beans. We do work in Uganda, in Malawi, in Mozambique, and other places with orange flesh sweet potatoes, and so on. We know, though, that there is no single silver bullet. There is no single solution to this challenge. So we do many other things. And the important learning from the second Lancet series on nutrition demonstrated the need to, really highlighted the need to work on these many related areas that relate to nutrition. So we have programs to improve hygiene and water quality and so on, so that we can actually reap the benefits of our biofortified crops so that they actually stay in the body long enough to be properly digested rather than run through if people are drinking contaminated water. We also look for other ways to leverage our efforts. One way that we were involved in is is working with African leaders, particularly from the African Union, to stand up the new Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition. Again, we put nutrition in the name when the group of leaders launched that, and President Obama announced it in May of 2012. There too, we put this kind of clarity of purpose around it with a goal of lifting 50 million people in sub-Saharan Africa out of poverty through agricultural growth spurred by private sector investment. And we've seen some of those investors investing in nutrient-rich crops, in ready-to-use therapeutic foods, and so on. So up the road in Mozambique, or down the road in Mozambique, there's a company called Lausanne Farms that is promoting high-protein crops like soy, high vitamin A crops like orange flesh sweet potatoes as a commercial endeavor and aiming to reach smallholder farmers. So we look at these many layers of complexity and try to manage them into our programs. And again, we look for innovative ways to work with private sector and civil society. That involves sometimes working with governments to improve enabling environments for both of these sectors to work effectively, both private sector and civil society. We look to national governments to set the leadership. And in the area of nutrition, some of that has been stimulated through the Scaling Up Nutrition movement, which we've been an early supporter of. And then we're also looking to get our own house in order and to manage our own complex approach to global nutrition in ever better ways. We're starting at USAID with a global nutrition strategy that will be the first time USAID has put on paper across all of its sectors of work, agriculture, health, education, and everything else, the ways that it will address the undernutrition challenge in the world. And that will serve as a foundation for a broader whole of government coordination plan on global nutrition. So that way we can take account of all the agencies of the US government that work in this space. And so, I come from the Department of State. We have people working at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, people working at the U.S. Health and Human Services Agency, or Department rather, at the Centers for Disease Control, at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, even at the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, doing work that relates to nutrition. We've got to get them all on the same page, making sure that we're coordinating as effectively as possible. And so that's the ultimate lesson, is that it takes constant self-improvement in our efforts. We have to constantly look to see if we're doing what we intend to do, and look for ways to improve the impact. And then underlying that, again, we still need to have that leadership from the top and that clarity of purpose and really the passion to keep doing what we're doing. And there, I pick up some of the points that Minister Adesina was making, that we live in a world today where, look at the table you're sitting at. You're sitting at a table of 8. One of those seats, if we were all globally average, would be occupied by someone who's going to bed hungry every night, because 1 in 8 people in the world today are hungry. And when we look at the nutrition piece of that, it's 1 in 4 children in the world who are stunted. I have 4 children. If one of those children ended up stunted, that would be just an unacceptable situation. The situation we have in the world today is equally unacceptable. And so we need to keep up the passion and commitment to make a difference.
From developed to developing, the challenges of getting every piece of government focused around this as ministers have said, as a key component of growth and opportunity going forward is coming through very clearly. So every policymaker wants really solid data, really clear science and evidence upon which to stake their careers as they stake out a leadership position to drive a country forward. So, Tim, how do we present science so that we can bridge this gap between science and policy? What have you learned from your positions on both in advising but also as a scientist in how to best do that well? It seems to me that there is still a science policy gap sometimes which has to be bridged, but it's also the dissemination, right, of the science so that this can be taken up quickly and easily, and the policy alternatives that come with the science. So the so what question, I think, so often is the hardest one of all. So how would you, what have you learned? How can science help us in this moving forward from the Monday morning question? What are we all going to do? How can you help? What have you learned?
Yes, thank you, Rachel. A great question, a tough one that I think neither I nor anyone else has a perfect answer to, but I'll give it a go. I mean, first of all, I'd like to thank Howdy for inviting us to attend here, and thank everyone for their contribution, which I benefited enormously from in the last 3 days. And of course, having a name of Wheeler, beginning with W, I'm always used to being at the end of the line, so I'm perfectly comfortable with fitting in at the very bottom of the schedule and have adjusted to that in my career. Let me break that question down into two broad points. Point number one, how do we define the main gaps and challenges for obtaining the evidence needed by policymakers? And then point number two, then how do we go about sharing that evidence with the policy community, and how can we do that in an effective way? So we kicked off the conference in the first day by asking the question, how can biofortification support nutrition-sensitive policy making? And I guess in agricultural research, this means how can we demonstrate that investing in agricultural development has the desired impacts on nutrition, health, and livelihoods? And the evidence is the key part in that demonstration. And I think there's many strands to this. I pulled out 4 that I'd like to just put past you in terms of trying to fill this gap between the evidence and the policy. Number one, of course, the evidence base is vast and is increasing all the time. So point number one is we have to assemble and quality assure the research evidence that we already have. And somehow we have to put quality standards on what is a mass of evidence in order to convert it into knowledge. Now, one way you can do that, and something we've done in DFID in the last 4 or 5 years, is to use this systematic review protocols. These very strict protocols that have been developed within the medical literature for assessing the evidence base against a fixed set of criteria, using a fixed protocol, and then making your meta-analysis from all those pieces of evidence that pass the bar. So Eduardo Massé and colleagues in 2011 published the first systematic review in the topic of this conference. They asked the question, is there evidence that agricultural interventions can have nutritional outcomes? And for those who have seen it, we've updated it recently, and we've asked that question again 2 years later. The primary finding from that systematic review was that biofortification is probably the only agricultural intervention targeted at nutritional outcomes where the evidence base, although it is small, is becoming sufficiently robust to support policy decisions. I think that's a very important conclusion. It's a strong but tentative support for investments in biofortification because they can be shown to provide robust evidence for policy. And of course, number 2 is, well, let's not stop there. We need to produce new high-quality evidence and robust evidence of what works and what doesn't work in agriculture for nutrition. There's a couple of examples from the DFID portfolio that are doing just this. Professor Swaminathan yesterday introduced us to LANSA, Leveraging Agriculture for Nutrition in South Asia program that's going really well and is generating new, rigorous, and locally relevant evidence. We also have the Nutrition Embedding Evaluation program that's working with program implementers to identify opportunities to insert robust evaluations into ongoing initiatives, learning from doing, learning from lessons from ongoing research programs. Number 3 out of the 4 is I'm pretty convinced that we need to continue to invest in the discovery pipeline. So as we concentrate in many parts of this conference on the scaling up questions, which are really important, let's still keep an eye on that pipeline, because that pipeline is slow and is long, as has already been highlighted. Research has to look ahead. It has to look ahead for the problems that are 5, 10, 15 years from now. And if you stop doing that, then when we get to the point 5, 10, 15 years from now when that problem perhaps is bigger, then our tools are not available to us. And I'm particularly concerned with the climate change side of this. In a sense, we now have biofortified seeds, biofortified tubers that are adapted to the current conditions, but those that we're developing now will be growing in those conditions of tomorrow, when we know that we're already committed to some degree of climate change, as this week's IPCC report has shown us. We need to combine the nutritional and yield advantages of iron beans that we have today with resilience for the climate that we expect tomorrow. And that is a long-term solution. It requires long-term solutions and is a long-term problem. And then lastly, I think we need to expand our evidence base on other nutrient-enhancing options. The term silver bullet has come up many times in the last 2 or 3 days. Biofortification has an important place to play, but it'd be one amongst a suite of options. And the evidence on some of those other options is extremely poor. And in order to develop locally relevant, context-specific options, we need to have as many tools in the box as we can. So moving to my second point then, with all this evidence that's available, quality assured, and new ongoing processes generate more, then how do we share that with policymakers in order to make long-term change at a large scale? Let me start this section with a quote from Prime Minister David Cameron's speech at the Nutrition for Growth event in June 2013. And I quote, and this quote comes from a section where he's starting to move from comments on business to comments on science. For science, it's about harnessing the power of innovation to develop better seeds and more nutritious and productive crops, like the African breeders who bred the orange flesh sweet potato. Regular sweet potatoes in Africa have little or no vitamin A, an essential nutrient that prevents blindness and infant's death. But just one scoop of orange flesh sweet potato meets a child's daily vitamin A needs. Programs like this have helped farmers increase their incomes by up to 400%. End of quote. So what did this quote tell us in the context of the panel discussion today? Well, I think in general, robust research evidence is the greatest chance of influencing policy when it is well communicated and it is well timed. And let me just add a few comments on those 2 points. It's well communicated because it's backed up by stories of success, some of the wonderful stories that we had in the panel discussion yesterday. It's backed up by research and robust evidence that's quality assured. And all of those stories and evidence are communicated in a way that the policymaker can just snap it up and use it in what inevitably is a very busy schedule. And just to give you a related example, the IPCC report that was released on Monday was, as many of you know, 30 chapters long, had an enormous summary, as it was called, and included the input of many hundreds of scientists. So my briefing on Monday morning for ministers was of 7 pages. It consisted of a smaller briefing of 3 pages, and just for those shorter time had a single sentence. That is the form that particular briefing was communicated to the policymakers with whom I'm working. And then I think influential bodies like the Global Panel that Rachel has already mentioned, that Kim also sits on, has a role in that interface between evidence and policy. They have the knowledge, the skills, the leadership qualities that enables them also to frame some of the evidence into the form in which policymakers can easily pick up and take into their decision-making processes. It also has to be well-timed. The Growth event was attended by presidents, prime ministers, and leaders of international organizations, foundations, NGOs, and businesses, the majority of whom were from the African continent. It provided new commitments, up to $4.5 billion worth of new commitments to tackle undernutrition. And the achievements of Harvest Plus, of course, were right up there, as I read in that opening speech. It was a fantastic showcase for the work that all of you are doing in Harvest Plus, and also reflected a lot of hard work on behalf of my staff in DFID's research division in order to grasp this opportunity. The timing of getting that research message into the highest level political forum that was absolutely key. And luckily, we got it right. So the Nutrition for Growth event in 2013 highlighted the importance of scientific research from Harvest Plus and others, and generated, in a sense, a tacit support for the many technologies for improving the nutrition outcomes. DFID itself committed its own support to further support of Harvest Plus, which many of you will be familiar. It committed support to the International Potato Centre, and DFID remains committed to supporting the CGIAR system as a whole. We're also working closely with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and others within the room to develop new programs where we can develop new robust evaluations to toughen the research up again for policymakers. So in conclusion, perhaps looking ahead, I mean, it's clearly a transition point for Harvest Plus with major technology generated now. It's been tested in the field, and the challenge ahead is then to achieve that step change in the scale-up of growth of biofortified crops and the marketing of biofortified foods. Possibly as an intermediate step, we should look forward to the third Biofortification Conference and ask ourselves the question at that time, will we have mainstreamed the impact of agriculture on girls and women? Will we have captured the potential of the private sector? Will we have expanded the pipeline of new innovations and strengthened the research evidence base and secured changes in agricultural policies to achieve nutrition outcomes? So finally, as we approach the next rainy season here in Rwanda, there's a tremendous groundswell of activity and achievements underneath the Harvest Plus umbrella. The next steps will require an even greater shared effort as we seek to scale up these achievements. We at DFID will continue to work with Harvest Plus and all of you in the room to try to meet our shared goals of using innovations in agriculture for improved nutrition and health.